Special Containment Procedures. SCP-507 remains in provisional low-security housing within Site, granted privileges far beyond the standard allowances for safe-class anomalies. It is permitted limited access to the facility network under proxy supervision and may request interaction with other non-hostile SCP entities. This leniency is justified by two factors: the apparent unpredictability of SCP-507's anomaly and the absence of malicious behavior throughout its containment history. Nevertheless, a mandatory 2-week protocol is observed. No direct physical contact is to be initiated with SCP-507 if more than 14 days have elapsed since its last displacement. Violation of this directive has previously resulted in collateral disappearances, and disciplinary measures are unnecessary given the self-punitive risks involved. Whenever SCP-507 undergoes an involuntary shift, the Foundation's Monitoring Division is to maintain passive surveillance for reappearance signatures. Daily beacon checks confirm whether the subject has returned. Should SCP-507 manifest outside of Site grounds, a 3-agent retrieval unit is authorized for extraction using non-threatening escort methods. On return, SCP-507 is subject to 2 weeks of post-shift medical and psychological testing. The subject has requested and been granted possession of a flashlight, non-lethal firearm, and prophylactic antifungal agents after specific incidents in alternate realities. These requests are logged and considered on a case-by-case basis. Description: SCP-507 is a Caucasian male of average build, slightly overweight, with blonde hair and green eyes. Despite its otherwise mundane appearance, SCP-507 possesses a spontaneous extra-dimensional displacement anomaly. At irregular intervals, the subject vanishes from baseline reality, reappearing days or weeks later. These displacements are not instantaneous teleportations, but full immersions into parallel dimensions that approximate baseline geography while diverging in climate, population, or ontology. SCP-507 consistently insists that the process is involuntary and cannot be predicted or resisted. Observation confirms this. Disappearances have occurred while speaking mid-sentence, asleep, or performing routine tasks. Mentally, SCP-507 demonstrates no major deviations from civilian psychological baselines. Subject's demeanor is cooperative, occasionally displaying humor or cynicism when recounting experiences. It habitually resists disclosing its civilian name, instead inviting personnel to assign nicknames, several of which are now in official rotation. Records of its asylum confinement prior to Foundation custody reveal repeated unexplained escapes, initially interpreted as breaches of security rather than anomalous events. Recovered evidence confirmed SCP-507's anomaly, leading to its transfer into Foundation containment under the pretense of relocation. SCP-507 describes alternate realities with consistency across interviews, often supplementing with object requests upon return. One documented displacement placed the subject in an abandoned mirror image of Site, occupied by corpse-like entities coated in fungal matter exhibiting rhythmic respiration. Another left the subject in complete darkness, accompanied by ambient breathing. A later encounter in a similar dimension introduced the so-called Smiling Man, a humanoid entity in a suit with an exaggerated grin, capable of approaching unnoticed until illuminated. SCP-507 has also manifested in realities infested with arachnids, atmospheric anomalies, or entities resembling familiar SCP phenomena, raising suspicion of cross-SCP correlation. Although classified safe, SCP-507 presents potential containment hazards. The possibility of collateral displacement was confirmed when agent vanished during incidental contact and expunged. The agent did not return, forcing new containment restrictions. The subject remains under close surveillance, though continued cooperation has prevented escalation in classification. SCP-507's records suggest increasing severity and hostility within the encountered dimensions. Whether these exposures follow random distribution or an escalating progression remains under review. The subject's origin traces back to Asylum, a facility with a reputation for mishandled records and frequent escapes. Foundation surveillance protocols flagged the institution after multiple disappearances of one patient occurred without signs of tampering or external assistance. Staff reported that the individual would be present during head counts, only to vanish without warning, later discovered wandering kilometers away under circumstances no one could account for. Initial suspicion centered on institutional negligence, but the sheer consistency of these events forced deeper investigation. Foundation field operatives infiltrated the asylum under the guise of medical auditors, installing covert recording equipment and interviewing patients and staff. Within 2 weeks, surveillance captured the anomaly. The patient was mid-conversation with an orderly when he dissolved from the frame, leaving behind only the impression of his weight in the chair. Hours later, the subject was found in a rural field over 40 kilometers away, disoriented but otherwise unharmed. The incident corroborated reports and triggered formal containment procedures. Records recovered from the asylum described the subject as generally cooperative, if prone to evasiveness when asked about his background. Witness testimonies suggest he enjoyed constructing false narratives about his origins, claiming at various times to have been born in Europe, South America, or nowhere at all. Staff considered these delusions symptomatic of a dissociative disorder until evidence of his anomalous disappearances mounted. The institution attempted to increase security, restraints, locked wards, even sedation, but none of these measures prevented the phenomenon. The decisive incident came during a mass patient recreation period in the yard. Witnesses reported that the subject vanished in full view of over 30 inmates and staff, leaving widespread panic. 2 days later, he reappeared in the asylum's boiler room, covered in ash and soil, muttering about doors without hinges and corridors that bent. At this point, Foundation operatives intervened, seizing all documentation and fabricating a narrative of patient transfer. Staff were amnesticized, and public records erased the patient's existence under standard obfuscation protocols. Interrogations conducted immediately after transfer to Foundation custody revealed the subject's own perception of his condition. He described each disappearance not as escape, but as a compulsion, an external force pulling him out of reality. His insistence that he had no control over when or where it occurred matched observational data collected at the asylum. He noted that while the landscapes of these other places resembled his home reality, they were populated by entities or features that defied explanation. Initial skepticism from Foundation staff gave way to concern when, during one of the first debriefings, he disappeared mid-sentence in front of 2 researchers. Upon his first return under Foundation observation, he was found at a gas station 40 kilometers from site, clutching a newspaper dated 3 days ahead of the current timeline. The cashier recalled him entering abruptly, visibly shaken, and demanding to know if this place is the right one. He was detained by undercover agents within minutes and escorted back to containment. This confirmed that the displacements were neither voluntary nor localized, but a phenomenon beyond conventional dimensional mechanics. The Foundation officially designated him SCP-507 following these events. Containment protocols were drafted not around preventing the anomaly, which appeared impossible, but around monitoring, minimizing collateral damage, and cataloging information gleaned from each shift. At this stage, SCP-507 was still largely cooperative, often volunteering descriptions of his travels with a mixture of fear and dark amusement. The anomaly's classification as safe was based on the absence of deliberate harm, though internal memoranda already warned that the potential for cross-contamination between realities could not be underestimated. The Foundation's first organized investigation into SCP-507's condition was carried out at site under a controlled observation program. The objective was to establish a baseline of his shifting episodes, cataloging frequency, duration, and environmental triggers, Initial expectations were that these displacements could be predicted, perhaps even manipulated. The subject was placed under constant video surveillance, monitored by biometric sensors, and instructed to record every sensation preceding an event. Despite this meticulous preparation, the first observed shift occurred without warning while SCP-507 was asleep in his quarters. Sensors recorded no anomalies before the disappearance. One moment his vitals registered normally, and the next, every reading ceased. When SCP-507 returned 3 days later, Foundation personnel noted several inconsistencies. His clothing was torn and coated in a residue resembling mineral dust. Microscopic analysis revealed compounds not native to Earth's crust, suggesting exposure to non-terrestrial geology. The subject recounted finding himself in a desert-like landscape with a sky described as the wrong color, too bright, and too close. He reported seeing structures in the distance but avoided them after noticing movement resembling insect swarms. This testimony immediately raised alarms as the possibility of hostile ecosystems was confirmed. Subsequent investigations sought to determine whether SCP-507's disappearances left any energetic or spatial traces. Sensitive equipment was deployed around his quarters: electromagnetic field monitors, tachyon counters, and experimental dimensional anchors. None provided conclusive results. The shift was instantaneous, leaving no detectable residue, not even air displacement. Researchers debated whether the anomaly was a personal effect, localized solely around the subject, or if it involved larger manipulations of space-time masked from human instruments. Internal disputes grew tense, as some staff argued the phenomenon indicated the existence of permanent rifts, while others maintained it was an isolated, non-replicable anomaly. The first attempt at containment during a shift came when a team introduced restraints. SCP-507 was secured with high-grade shackles connected to anchored steel bolts. The restraints were intended to test whether physical binding could prevent displacement. When the next shift occurred, the subject and restraints vanished together, leaving the bolts intact. 3 days later, he reappeared without the restraints, explaining that they had rotted away in an hour after arriving in a damp, fungus-choked environment. Material analysis of what remained confirmed exposure to aggressive organic decay unknown to baseline biology. The test was classified as a failure, and restraints were deemed irrelevant. Another attempt involved chemical sedation. SCP-507 was administered heavy doses of anesthetics under medical supervision, with hopes that unconsciousness might suppress or at least delay displacement. The shift occurred regardless, mid-procedure, leaving medical staff in shock. He later reappeared unharmed but visibly shaken, describing having woken standing in a forest of black trees, their branches creaking in a wind that seemed to whisper his name. This incident confirmed that neither physical nor chemical interventions affected the anomaly. As data accumulated, Foundation psychologists noted that SCP-507 displayed mild symptoms of trauma after each return. Nightmares, anxiety during periods exceeding 2 weeks without a shift, and compulsive behaviors such as always carrying light sources or defensive objects were documented. Despite this, the subject remained cooperative, insisting on recounting his experiences in exhaustive detail. These testimonies became the backbone of Document 507-0, an evolving catalog of his journeys. Each account suggested not mere alternate versions of Earth, but realms infected with phenomena hostile to human existence. The Foundation's strategy shifted from prevention to observation. Personnel were instructed to prepare retrieval teams for rapid response upon his reappearance. More importantly, the possibility of SCP-507 encountering other anomalies or equivalents of known SCPs in alternate realities was raised in classified reports. Senior researchers debated whether SCP-507's ability was a key to mapping multiversal threats or an unstable liability capable of importing contamination. By the close of the first investigative cycle, Consensus held that while SCP-507 posed minimal direct threat, his very existence exposed the Foundation to risks impossible to quantify. Foundation documentation describes SCP-507's anomaly not as a form of teleportation, but as full transference into parallel realities. The mechanics remain elusive. The subject vanishes entirely, leaving no measurable energy fluctuations or distortions. Interviews confirm that SCP-507 retains full bodily integrity during each shift and reappears in baseline reality with any objects carried, provided they survive the alternate environment. This feature has given researchers limited opportunities to analyze foreign substances, though most degrade rapidly after exposure to our dimension. The environments encountered by SCP-507 range from the merely unsettling to the actively hostile. In some shifts, the geography aligns perfectly with baseline Earth, yet populated by anomalous flora or fauna. In others, human presence is entirely absent, replaced by creatures that defy classification. One example, noted in Document 50700, describes an abandoned replica of site strewn with decaying bodies. Closer inspection revealed the corpses rhythmically expanding and contracting as though breathing, coated in fungal growth resembling cordyceps. The subject's testimony indicated that the infection had spread beyond the facility, enveloping the external world in a living network of mold. This case directly influenced containment protocols, as concerns arose over cross-contamination. Other instances emphasize the unpredictability of SCP-507's encounters. During one displacement, the subject reported total darkness punctuated by the sound of breathing. Choosing immobility, SCP-507 avoided contact with the unseen entity. A later shift brought him face to face with a humanoid figure in a black suit and sunglasses, known in Foundation records as the Smiling Man. SCP-507 described the figure as unnaturally close, its grin extending beyond normal anatomy. When startled by the subject's flashlight, the entity remarked, "Back so soon," before advancing. SCP-507 discharged all rounds from a Foundation-issued firearm loaded with rubber bullets, then curled into a corner until he was returned. Despite the lack of physical injury, psychological assessments confirmed lingering distress. Less dramatic but equally concerning are shifts that expose SCP-507 to conditions uninhabitable for long-term survival. In one case, he appeared in an arid desert with a distorted sky and structures in the distance. The environment's air contained particulate matter incompatible with human respiration, and SCP-507 reported difficulty breathing. In another, the subject returned covered in fine spider silk, refusing to elaborate beyond muttering, "Too many." These accounts underscore the absence of pattern or safety. SCP-507 may emerge in environments where survival is a matter of luck. Analysis of the anomaly suggests it is not governed by cyclical timing. Recorded intervals between shifts vary from days to months, although a minimum 2-week gap has been consistently documented. The displacement's duration is equally inconsistent, ranging from hours to weeks. Yet one constant persists. SCP-507 always reappears within Earth's corresponding geography, displaced only by the movements he undertook while away. This feature implies a structural mirroring of dimensions, though their content may diverge catastrophically. While the subject's physiology shows no permanent alterations, his possessions often bear traces of exposure. Fungal spores, non-terrestrial minerals, and degraded fabrics have been cataloged, though most samples disintegrate or lose anomalous properties within days. This degradation has frustrated attempts to perform in-depth cross-dimensional study. The few surviving materials have raised further concern, particularly one instance where fragments displayed properties resembling SCP-407's fungal effects. Researchers now speculate that SCP-507's shifts may intersect dimensions influenced by anomalies parallel to those cataloged in our reality. The working description of SCP-507 emphasizes the passive, involuntary nature of the anomaly. There is no evidence of intent nor of external control, yet the experiences logged suggest growing intensity, Early displacements were mildly disorienting, but subsequent ones introduced overtly hostile elements, from predatory figures to ecological collapse. Whether this escalation reflects random chance, a progression tied to SCP-507 himself, or a broader interdimensional structure remains unknown. Foundation consensus acknowledges that SCP-507 is both vulnerable and invaluable, a window into realms that challenge the very boundaries of containment. Prolonged observation of SCP-507 has demonstrated that the psychological impact of his condition is as severe as the physical dangers of displacement. While his outward demeanor remains lighthearted and cooperative, detailed interviews reveal recurring trauma markers. Night terrors, episodes of dissociation, and compulsive behavior, such as insisting on carrying a flashlight at all times, suggest a chronic adaptation to environments where darkness conceals predators. Medical staff have noted a pattern. Within several days of reappearing, SCP-507 experiences heightened anxiety, often pacing his quarters or requesting the presence of personnel during mundane activities. These behaviors gradually subside until the cycle repeats with the next shift. First-hand testimonies are especially illuminating. After returning from the dimension populated by corpse-like organisms covered in fungal growth, SCP-507 describes sensations of the ground breathing beneath his feet, as if the entire world were alive and aware of him. He confessed that during the encounter he felt watched continuously, though no eyes were visible. Despite his casual tone during debriefings, biometric readings, pulse, sweat response, pupil dilation spiked dramatically whenever he recounted the event. Foundation psychologists identified this as an involuntary stress response, confirming the internal conflict between his attempts at humor and his underlying trauma. Other shifts left subtler yet equally damaging imprints. Following the encounter with the smiling man, SCP-507 avoided all reflective surfaces for weeks, citing a fear that the figure might reappear from behind the glass. He also developed an aversion to enclosed rooms without visible exits, frequently requesting doors to remain unlocked, even when this violated protocol. Medical staff reluctantly permitted minor concessions, fearing that the stress of absolute restriction might provoke a breakdown. One report suggested that the subject's coping mechanism, deflecting terror with jokes, was not sustainable and might eventually collapse into full psychosis. Physical examinations show no enduring anomalies, but short-term effects often accompany returns. In one incident, SCP-507's skin exhibited temporary discoloration, resembling frostbite, consistent with his account of appearing in a frozen tundra without protective clothing. Another time, his lungs tested positive for fungal spores that degraded rapidly once isolated, leaving only inert residue. Repeated monitoring has yet to identify cumulative damage, though concerns persist about the potential for latent infection or unseen parasitic influence. Foundation biologists stress that the apparent harmlessness of retrieved samples may not rule out long-term risks. Witness accounts from staff further illustrate the toll on SCP-507. Agents assigned to retrieval teams describe him as cooperative but visibly exhausted, often collapsing into silence during transport. In one case, personnel noted that he clutched a handful of dirt, refusing to release it until sedation was administered. Later analysis revealed the soil contained compounds resembling rare earth elements, but in configurations unknown to terrestrial chemistry. Psychologists interpreted his attachment not as scientific curiosity, but as a desperate attempt to anchor himself to something tangible from the shifting realities he endured. Despite these traumas, SCP-507 has never displayed overt hostility or aggression toward Foundation personnel. He occasionally resists detailed questioning, claiming that some experiences are better left unspoken. These refusals are taken seriously. In the few cases where he eventually shared withheld accounts, the descriptions were profoundly disturbing. One such testimony involved hearing his own voice echo through the environment, speaking words he had not said. This incident raised speculation about cognitive contamination, leading to debates about whether prolonged exposure to foreign dimensions might erode identity itself. Cumulative evidence suggests that SCP-507's condition subjects him not only to physical hazards, but also to continuous psychological erosion. He is simultaneously a victim, a witness, and a reluctant explorer of realities that resist comprehension. Foundation psychiatrists note that his resilience so far is anomalous in its own right. Few humans could withstand repeated confrontations with hostile ecosystems and entities without collapsing into complete dysfunction. Nevertheless, the cracks are widening, and internal memoranda warn that SCP-507 may eventually become unstable, not because of malice, but because no human psyche was designed to endure such relentless dislocation. Systematic experimentation with SCP-507 was initiated once the Foundation accepted that neither restraints nor sedation could prevent displacement. The research mandate shifted from containment to exploration. If the anomaly could not be controlled, then its byproducts might at least be studied. However, nearly every attempt to probe the mechanics of the shifts resulted in failure, contamination, or inconclusive data. The first structured trial involved equipping SCP-507 with monitoring equipment, cameras, biometric recorders, and locational beacons. Although the devices disappeared along with him, their return proved unreliable. Some reappeared intact but empty of stored data, as if overwritten. Others were destroyed beyond recognition, corroded by unknown substances. In one case, the subject returned with the beacon still attached, yet its power cell had been replaced by a crystalline object resembling quartz. Analysis revealed that the crystal emitted no radiation, but produced a persistent electrical hum that ceased after 48 hours. The object degraded into dust shortly afterward, leaving nothing but a faint metallic odor. Biological testing was attempted with great caution. In one experiment, SCP-507 was instructed to carry a sealed container with bacterial cultures during a shift. Upon return, the cultures had been destroyed. Their cellular structures collapsed into formless sludge. Genetic sequencing failed, with the samples showing fragmented nucleotides incompatible with any known life. This outcome raised fears that organisms from baseline reality could not survive transference. Conversely, when SCP-507 accidentally brought spores back on his clothing, they initially showed aggressive vitality before decaying into inert mass. This inconsistency undermined hopes of establishing controlled biological exchange. Attempts at communication across realities fared no better. On one occasion, SCP-507 was fitted with a transceiver designed to transmit continuously on a protected frequency. During displacement, the signal persisted for only 3 minutes, transmitting a series of distorted tones and static before ceasing. When analyzed spectrographically, the tones resembled patterns associated with human speech, though no direct translation was possible. A second attempt captured 7 minutes of broadcast filled with irregular breathing sounds, cut abruptly as though the device had been crushed. The recovered fragments remain classified under Level 3 security clearance, pending correlation with other anomalous acoustic phenomena. Psychological experiments sought to determine whether SCP-507 could exert influence over the shifts. Researchers instructed him to focus on familiar places, repeat mantras, or resist movement upon feeling an onset. None of these attempts altered the outcomes. In fact, several led to worse experiences. During one trial, he attempted to anchor himself by clutching the edge of his bed, only to describe the furniture dissolving into liquid when the shift occurred. In another, he reported hearing voices urging him to let go, though biometric records show he was alone at the time. Repeated failures began to shift the research atmosphere into frustration. Certain staff members argued that SCP-507 was not a research asset, but a hazard, capable of importing dangerous influences into baseline reality. Others countered that his unique condition offered a rare chance to map the nature of parallel dimensions. The growing debate led to more aggressive experiments, including one incident where SCP-507 was unknowingly administered a cocktail of stimulants to test whether heightened metabolism could prevent displacement. He vanished regardless, returning violently ill, his bloodstream flooded with chemical byproducts, interacting unpredictably with the foreign environment. The overseeing doctor was reprimanded, but the event deepened mistrust between subject and staff. As the failures accumulated, SCP-507 himself grew increasingly reluctant to cooperate with risky trials. He insisted that many of the experiments ignored the obvious. "I'm not a door, I'm just the one being pushed through it." Nevertheless, the Foundation persisted, albeit with stricter oversight. The outcome of these trials made one fact clear. Containment was impossible, control was an illusion, and the anomaly's true mechanics lay beyond the current scope of Foundation science. What remained was careful documentation of each failure, not for the sake of progress, but as a growing warning of what happens when human protocols collide with forces indifferent to them. Recovered documents and addenda related to SCP-507 provide the most disturbing glimpses into the anomaly's true implications. Among them are fragments of SCP-507's own notes, hastily written in uneven handwriting after his returns. These journals are not officially authorized, yet several were discovered hidden among his personal effects, later confiscated and archived under restricted clearance. In one such entry, he writes, "I keep hearing the same breath in every place I go. It doesn't matter if it's desert, forest, or empty city. It's like something is following me, only waiting for the dark to settle. I don't tell them this anymore. They just take notes, and it feels like they're missing the point." Transcripts of interviews show further anomalies. During interview 507G, SCP-507 recounted a shift in which he encountered a dilapidated urban sprawl, lit only by flickering street lamps. Surveillance footage, obtained from a handheld recorder issued to him, captured several seconds of video before collapsing into static. Within that brief segment, indistinct human shapes appeared frozen mid-stride, their faces blurred beyond recognition. When asked to elaborate, SCP-507 refused, insisting the figures turned their heads toward him simultaneously as soon as the light touched them. Audio logs reveal him whispering repeatedly, "They knew I wasn't theirs." Additional documents contain reports from retrieval teams. One such record details a return where SCP-507 appeared outside a roadside diner at 02:13 local time. Staff inside reported hearing him knock frantically on the locked door, shouting incoherently before collapsing. Surveillance footage later reviewed from the diner's external cameras showed SCP-507 staggering across the lot, followed closely by a tall figure dressed in black. The figure vanished from the recording the moment headlights from a passing truck illuminated the area. When debriefed, SCP-507 insisted he had been alone. The Foundation has redacted this file heavily, and official documentation now omits mention of the figure. There are also communications intercepted from SCP-507's online activity. Despite being monitored under a restricted proxy, one outgoing draft email was captured before transmission. Addressed ambiguously to whoever still remembers, the message read, "I'm not the only one. I've seen others between the places. Some scream, some don't notice me. If you find this, don't follow the corridors." The Foundation classified this as either a hallucination or a deliberate act of disinformation, though dissenting researchers argue that it may confirm the existence of other displaced individuals. One of the most chilling addenda is a heavily censored transcript of an unauthorized audio recording SCP-507, made after returning from a month-long absence. He describes hearing his own voice call to him from behind closed doors, repeating private thoughts he had never spoken aloud. When pressed, he admitted that on 2 occasions, he opened those doors and saw himself staring back. Once silent, once whispering warnings, he refused to repeat. His request at the end of the tape was simple. "Burn this. Don't let anyone else hear it. The Foundation instead archived it under Document 507-3B. Other recovered fragments include mundane yet unsettling details. A crumpled receipt from a grocery store listing items in an alphabet unrecognized by linguistic databases, a child's drawing depicting SCP-507 surrounded by faceless figures, and a fragment of music captured on a malfunctioning recorder that exactly matched SCP-507's humming during sleep, though he denies ever having heard the tune before. Each addendum reinforces the same theme. SCP-507's shifts are not random wanderings through harmless alternate landscapes. They are incursions into dimensions layered with intelligence, entities aware of his presence, and structures that mirror but distort baseline reality. The growing body of documents suggests that every return carries not only physical residue, but also psychological and informational contamination. Researchers debate whether these traces are valuable intelligence or the early signs of something attempting to bleed through him into our world. Internal disputes within the Foundation regarding SCP-507 escalated as more disturbing evidence accumulated. The initial consensus that the subject was safe began to fracture, with research divisions divided between those who saw him as a valuable observational asset and those who regarded him as an uncontrolled breach vector. Meetings of the Ethics Committee reveal sharp disagreements. One memorandum argued that SCP-507's trauma was being exploited under the guise of research, while another emphasized the strategic necessity of extracting as much data as possible before his inevitable psychological collapse. Censorship of findings became increasingly common. Several reports documenting encounters with entities resembling known anomalies were heavily redacted before dissemination. A field log noting fungal similarities to SCP-407 was altered to remove explicit correlations, with the justification that associative links without proof would incite unnecessary speculation. Junior researchers, frustrated by such omissions, circulated unsanctioned copies of the original files, sparking disciplinary actions and quiet reassignment of staff. Whispered accounts suggest that at least one researcher disappeared after confronting superiors about withheld evidence, though official records cite voluntary transfer. There were also cover-ups directed outward, concealing SCP-507's manifestations from the public. During one displacement, he reappeared in a crowded urban district at midday, disoriented and shouting incoherently about the wrong stars. Civilians filmed the event, uploading footage online within minutes. The Foundation's information suppression teams scrubbed the material, attributing it to a staged performance art piece. Internally, however, reports admitted that several bystanders described a second figure emerging briefly alongside SCP-507 before vanishing. The Foundation publicly denied this claim, classifying all testimonies as unreliable. Disputes extended into security policy. Some personnel advocated for stricter confinement, insisting that the risk of transdimensional contamination outweighed his cooperative behavior. Others resisted, pointing out that tighter restrictions would almost certainly destabilize his mental health and increase the chance of catastrophic incident. This debate intensified after the disappearance of Agent Chi, who vanished while making physical contact with SCP-507 during a shift. The official resolution declared the event an unavoidable accident, yet many within the department suspected negligence or concealed variables. Personal conflicts between staff and SCP-507 added further strain. Transcripts of counseling sessions reveal that he expressed awareness of being used as a test subject with legs, openly mocking researchers for what he called their desperate treasure hunts through my nightmares. Some personnel regarded this as hostility, while others recognized it as a coping mechanism under relentless pressure. Nonetheless, his sardonic attitude contributed to arguments that he could not be trusted indefinitely. Leaked notes from a site director's meeting highlight the tension. We are treating him as if he is benign, when in fact he is a walking hole in containment. His next shift could bring something back that we cannot erase. Another counterpoint from the same meeting reads, "If he is a whole, then we should look through it while we can. We cannot afford to close the only window we have into parallel anomalies." These conflicting stances hardened into bureaucratic stalemates, with policies shifting unpredictably depending on which faction held sway at the time. Even the classification of SCP-507 became a contested issue. Some proposed upgrading him to Euclid due to the uncontrolled and hazardous nature of his displacements. Others resisted, citing that he had never willingly endangered personnel and consistently returned with valuable intelligence. Ultimately, the designation remained safe, but only because official classification changes would trigger resource reallocations and public-facing documentation updates. Privately, several researchers admitted that the label was little more than administrative camouflage, a way to downplay the escalating uncertainty surrounding him. By this stage, it was no longer a question of whether SCP-507 posed a risk, but how long the Foundation could afford to ignore the widening cracks in its understanding. Behind the official facade of stability, the file had become a battlefield of redactions, quiet accusations, and strategic lies, all circling around one increasingly undeniable truth. SCP-507 was no longer just a passenger in other realities. He was a conduit, and the Foundation was divided on whether to exploit that connection or sever it at any cost. The escalation came without warning. For several months, SCP-507's displacements had followed a recognizable rhythm: disappearances lasting days or weeks, returns marked by exhaustion, and subsequent debriefings. But during one episode, the subject failed to return within the expected time frame. Tracking beacons emitted only static, and no retrieval signatures appeared for over 6 weeks. Internal memoranda show that Site debated whether to classify him as permanently lost. Then, at 0437 on a redacted, SCP-507 abruptly reappeared inside the facility cafeteria, collapsing onto the floor. Witnesses described him as bloodied, incoherent, and muttering about corridors that led nowhere, but still followed. The incident quickly revealed itself to be more than a delayed shift. Medical staff discovered deep lacerations across SCP-507's torso, resembling claw marks, but with edges too precise to be natural. His clothing was shredded, saturated with a viscous black fluid, later confirmed not to be his own blood. Analysis of the substance proved inconclusive. It contained protein structures consistent with terrestrial biology, but arranged in geometries unknown to any known species. Within hours, the liquid degraded into a tar-like residue, then evaporated without trace. Testimonies from personnel present during his collapse describe phenomena inconsistent with baseline reality. Several staff members reported seeing shadows elongate unnaturally, stretching toward SCP-507 as though drawn by his presence. One agent claimed that the temperature of the room dropped suddenly, his breath visible despite no environmental fluctuation registered by instruments. Security cameras recorded only static for the duration of the event, resuming moments after SCP-507 lost consciousness. These anomalies were never acknowledged in the official report, but circulated internally as evidence of a containment breach at metaphysical levels. When SCP-507 regained coherence, his testimony was fragmented and riddled with paranoia. He insisted that he had not merely been displaced, but pursued. According to his account, the smiling man had returned, accompanied by dozens of faceless figures. They shepherded him through shifting corridors that looped endlessly, whispering in voices that sounded like his own. At one point, he claimed, he encountered another version of himself chained to the wall, silent except for labored breathing. The memory triggered acute distress. Medical staff noted that he refused to continue speaking whenever the detail arose, pressing his hands against his ears until sedatives were administered. The most alarming element was his insistence that the entities attempted to follow him back. He described hearing them pounding on the thin door that separates dimensions, claiming that his sudden reappearance in baseline reality was not an escape but an ejection. They didn't let go. Something pushed me out. Whether this was delusion or authentic testimony remains unresolved, but coinciding anomalies during his return suggest that at least some interaction between realms occurred. Following the incident, containment protocols were temporarily upgraded. SCP-507 was moved to an isolation chamber surrounded by multi-dimensional dampening fields, typically reserved for high-threat anomalies. Staff rotations were tightened, and direct contact limited to essential personnel only. For several days after the event, reports surfaced of faint whispers near the chamber, though audio equipment recorded only low-level static. Guards described sensations of being watched from inside the walls. Officially, these accounts were attributed to stress and environmental suggestion. The escalation marked a turning point. SCP-507 was no longer regarded solely as an unwilling traveler. He was now a potential breach vector for entities capable of traversing with him, or worse, using him as an anchor. The final assessment of this incident concludes with a chilling line, redacted in most distributed copies but preserved in archival versions. If they can push him out, then they can pull him back in. And when they do, we cannot assume he will be alone. The aftermath of the major incident forced the Foundation to re-examine every assumption about SCP-507. The designation of safe, once defended on the basis of his cooperative nature and lack of direct hostility, became indefensible in the face of evidence that entities were actively interacting with him during displacements. Internal review boards pushed for immediate reclassification to Euclid, with some factions lobbying for Keter status given the unknown scale of the threat. The Ethics Committee, however, cautioned against reactionary escalation, noting that SCP-507 himself remained non-hostile and continued to comply with containment even as his mental state deteriorated. The final compromise resulted in an unofficial conditional Euclid designation, with all external documentation left unchanged to minimize resource strain and public-facing exposure. Containment procedures were rewritten, with emphasis on isolation. SCP-507 was relocated to a specially reinforced wing of Site, monitored continuously by multi-dimensional sensors and redundant failsafe systems. No physical contact with him is permitted after 14 days post-shift, and all interactions must be recorded for archival cross-reference. Following each return, SCP-507 undergoes immediate quarantine, medical scans, and psychological evaluation, with any retrieved foreign matter destroyed under high-containment incineration protocols. These procedures were justified not only to protect personnel, but to ensure that no entity could ride along into baseline reality unnoticed. Psychological assessments following the escalation confirm progressive deterioration. SCP-507 now speaks less freely of his experiences, claiming that words themselves attract attention from the ones listening. He refuses to recount certain shifts, shaking his head and repeating, "Not safe to say it here." Yet he still cooperates in small ways, providing sketches of environments or fragments of notes written in code-like shorthand. Researchers have noted recurring motifs in these sketches: doors, corridors, and eyes without faces, that align disturbingly with testimonies from staff who reported anomalous sensations during his last breach. Despite his condition, SCP-507 occasionally demonstrates resilience that puzzles Foundation psychiatrists. In one debriefing, he stated plainly, "I'm not the weapon, I'm the wound, and you don't heal wounds by digging into them deeper." This remark has been preserved in official records, cited by those who argue that further experimentation risks destabilizing both him and the dimensional boundaries tied to his anomaly. Nevertheless, research divisions continue to advocate for exploiting his condition as a means of reconnaissance, pointing out that the intelligence he inadvertently provides cannot be obtained by any other method. The long-term implications remain deeply uncertain. If SCP-507 is a singular case, then his anomaly represents a rare but manageable risk. If, however, his claim of seeing others between the places is true, then he may only be the first of many such displacements. Foundation contingency planning has already drafted Protocol Corridor, a set of emergency measures for large-scale incursions originating from parallel dimensions through unwilling human vectors. These drafts are classified at the highest levels, with access restricted to site directors and the O5 Council. SCP-507 today is a paradox. Harmless in intent, catastrophic in potential. He lives quietly within his quarters, afforded small privileges in recognition of his cooperation, yet surrounded by layers of security designed to contain threats that may not even originate from him. He remains, above all else, a reminder of how thin the membrane between realities can be, and how easily it can be pierced, not by hostile invasion, but by one man who never asked to be the conduit. The file closes with a final, heavily redacted note from O5 Command. Subject is not to be terminated. The risk of severing the anchor is greater than the risk of maintaining it. Continue observation. Prepare for the day the door opens from the other side.